The fallout from the federal government's decision to pause the carbon tax for home heating oil for 3 years. It's igniting political controversy across the country, with some provinces claiming unfair treatment. Seamus O'Regan is the Federal Minister of Labour, and he represents the riding of St. John South Mount Pearl in Newfoundland and Labrador. Minister O'Regan, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, David.
Since this move on Thursday to exempt home heating oil, there's been a lot of criticism. People saying that this undermines your argument that the carbon tax is affordable and that it's equally applied. What's your response?
My response is that I think it actually strengthens the carbon tax because, look, this is Canada. This is a country where we adapt policies to different parts of the country and to specific needs. Home heating oil is very specific in Atlantic Canada, mainly because it's so generally used. About half the population or at least half the households in PEI, some 36% in Nova Scotia, 22% in Newfoundland and Labrador. So you've got that. Plus, I mean, I know this as somebody who was on home heating oil. You've got incredible price volatility right now, with home heating oil that you just don't have elsewhere. And the intensity of pollutants in home heating oil is very particular. We had a problem, because the market mechanism of the policy of the price on pollution wasn't working. You had a $24,000 boulder there in front of it, some of which we've been whittling away at, but not enough to make a critical difference in an important part of the country in Atlantic Canada.
Right, but
people want to make the move, but they got to be able to afford to make the move.
Right, but now you have another big problem. Alberta is upset, Saskatchewan's upset, Ontario is upset. A lot of places that have been opponents of carbon pricing from the beginning. You've said all along that because of the rebates, people will be better off in terms of what they get back than what they pay out. Doesn't this move say that that's not the case, that you're doing this because it wasn't affordable for people?
First of all, nothing that we did on Thursday or Friday hurts anybody in Alberta, Saskatchewan, or frankly any other part of the country. And the exemption on home heating oil is national. It does affect Atlantic Canada the greatest because that's where the greatest, by far, concentration of users of home heating oil is. So no, I don't buy that argument. But we were hitting a roadblock on affordability,
should cover what they pay,
and not just affordability, but also the ability to find people to install heat pumps. We need more people doing that, and there's a lineup of people waiting. So in the interim, let's take a pause on the price on pollution. It's very important that we say that it's a pause because it's still an important market price signal. That is one of the strengths of the price on pollution. But on the other hand, we need to make sure that people have a chance.
Right, but the price volatility doesn't go away on oil by removing the carbon tax. It's still there, right? So it hasn't solved the price volatility issue. It's just now it's not applied in one part of the country while it is applied for people in Ontario who burn natural gas and people out west who burn natural gas. And you've got Premier Smith, who we're going to speak to, and Premiers Moe, who we're going to speak with, who say that is completely unfair.
Except for in 3 years' time, a lot of that price volatility won't matter because we'll have a critical mass of people in Atlantic Canada on heat pumps. And then that is up to like 2 to 3 times more efficient than even a fairly efficient furnace. So that will be a huge win. If we can identify a win and go for that win, let's do it.
Right. So this is an issue that is it's a policy that is national in its application, but it is more acutely an Atlantic issue because of the preponderance of people who burn home heating oil. Goody Hutchings, Rural Development Minister, was on with my colleague Vashi Kapelos on CTV this weekend, and she suggested in her answer that the Atlantic Caucus was able to make itself heard, and if the prairies had more Liberals, they'd be able to make themselves heard for exemptions on things like natural gas for home heating. Is that the government policy? More Liberals gets better results?
No.
What does she mean then?
But I don't speak for her. I will say this. I know because we're in caucus together. Atlantic Caucus, we were all home this summer. I heard from my constituents directly. There was a lot of anxiety about what the price on pollution applied to home heating oil would do to people because it is already astronomically high. It rose during the carbon price or the oil price war that happened at the same time as COVID. I was Natural Resources Minister. I remember it well. It has never gone down. It has only gone up for the most part, and people were really worried about it. There is a huge sensitivity in my riding and in my province because of rate mitigation, something with Muskrat Falls and something that we were able to $5.2 billion to mitigate, but there's a huge sensitivity to energy prices. And I know from the work that I did on rate mitigation that it does not take much to throw tens of thousands of households below the poverty line. So there's a great deal of anxiety. MPs heard it. We got together. We tried to find solutions. We took it to our national caucus. We took it to everybody. And at the end of the day, I think, following that timeline, we found a solution. There was I think a growing anxiety because we knew people were filling up their tanks right now, and we wanted to make sure that if we could find a solution that we acted.
Okay, so you're not hearing that from Western Canada? I mean, you got George Chahal, you got Randy Boissonneau in Alberta, you've got Ben Carr and other in Winnipeg. I mean, you're not hearing concerns from the western part of your caucus? I mean, what did Minister Hutchings mean by this?
The concern here was home heating oil, and the concern was the number of people in Atlantic Canada on home heating oil, which is far more expensive in a place that everybody in the country already recognizes suffers, unfortunately, from energy poverty.
Right. Look, I've heated my home with oil when I lived in St. John's, and I heat my home with gas now, and I will take the price of natural gas over the price of oil any day because there is a big gap there. But there's now a big gap in how this policy is being applied. The part of the country where you and me are from, and then in the part of the country where people like Danielle Smith and Scott Moe are from. And they look at this and say it is a double standard. Scott Moe said today that as of January 1, Sask Energy is going to stop collecting the carbon tax on natural gas and stop remitting it to the federal government because of what you guys did for the Atlantic region.
If we had absolute, consistent, and uniform policy in this country, I don't think we'd have a country. We always make sure that whenever we have federal policies, or for that matter, provincial policies, and I know as somebody who grew up in Labrador and thought that St. John's was the long arm of the law, let alone Ottawa, there are very particular exceptions, advantages and disadvantages to living in different parts of the country. And if you are going to apply public policy, you've got to make sure that you take advantage of those and that you're sensitive to those. I believe that quite firmly. When I was in my 20s, I wrote the Premier of the day and said, you're neglecting Labrador because the policies here are not specific to Labrador. I still hold to that. It's one of the reasons I'm in politics, to be honest with you. So if something's not working, you fix it. If it's not working any particular part of the country for particular circumstances, you are sensitive to it, you listen to it, and you change it, but do not give in on the objectives of it. And the objectives here, as always have been with the price on pollution, 1, lower emissions, 2, affordability.
But in September, Stephen Guilbeault, the Environment Minister, when Danielle Smith was looking for an exemption on the clean grid regulations to come in place by 2035, he said we can't have exemptions for specific parts of the country. It wouldn't be fair to the other parts. So he said no to Alberta 30 days ago.
He's talking about a policy that I know he is, quite familiar with. I'm not going to speak for that particular policy, but I do know that within this one, within the price on pollution, knowing that affordability was always at the core of the price on pollution. 8 out of 10 families do better. I mean, that's a fact. But you have that on the one hand, and you have wanting to lower emissions on the other. We have a very particular problem in Atlantic Canada with home heating oil, with its volatility, with its intensity, and with, and the fact that so many people use it, that if we can get rid of this significant obstacle that's in people's way, and make sure that while they are working on that, buying us some time to do that, we have a pause on the price on pollution as it's applied to home heating oil across the country. Right. Let's do it.
Look,
it makes sense because it will achieve those 2 goals. It looks at affordability square in the face, and it will lower emissions. We will come out of this with a critical mass of people in Atlantic Canada off of home heating oil.
Look, I understand the acute economic pressures, especially in rural Atlantic Canada, for people with houses that aren't worth a lot of money, and the inability to finance a heat pump and the costs end up being prohibitive. I understand all of that. But you have now the Premier of Saskatchewan threatening to stop collecting a federal tax, right? And you have the Premier of Alberta saying that, Guilbeault's refusal to give them an exemption on the grid and these comments by Minister Hutchings over the weekend just show that this is political and playing to a Liberal base. That's their argument.
Well, it's certainly being spun that way by people who were never fans of it in the first place. So I don't know why, we're all clutching our pearls and saying, my gosh, can you believe that they're saying this? I mean, this is right out of it. But on the other hand, I have done my level best as Natural Resources Minister and in my time now as Labour Minister as well and related to this file to try and take whenever I could, the politics out of this. I mean, the first trips I made as Labour Minister and as Natural Resources Minister were to Alberta and Saskatchewan. This is a huge national unity issue. We are the 4th largest producer of oil and 5th largest producer of natural gas in the world, and yet we want to do the right thing and show the world that it can be done. But this is going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take all hands on deck. We are not reaching net zero without Alberta and Saskatchewan, so I just need to make sure I work harder with them to find solutions.
So I appreciate, and just as a final question, I appreciate you probably haven't discussed this as a cabinet, but what is this government going to do if Saskatchewan stops collecting and remitting a federal tax.
This is a sequencing thing, because if I had discussed it in cabinet, I would tell you.
Well, you'd have a plan. You'd have a position, at least, that you could articulate. So I appreciate you may not be able to answer this right now. I mean, but how do you respond to that as the Premier threatening to defy the law?
Look, I think right now you have a lot of politics being played on an issue that I think, frankly, is just... at some point, I would like us to rise above partisanship on this issue, because it is such a consequential issue. It is, frankly, a mission of this country to show the world that we are capable of doing this. But it's going to be messy for a long time. We are going to be talking about lowering emissions and the issues of affordability, like they are in other democracies around the world. We're going to be talking about it for a long time. If I can do one thing, it is to try and lower the temperature on what is already a very hot topic, and I recognize that.
Labour Minister Seamus O'Regan, thanks for coming in.
Thank you, David.
And now for some of that provincial perspective, we turn to Alberta Premier Danielle Smith. Premier Smith, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So the federal government, through Minister O'Regan and others, are arguing the Atlantic provinces, this is a specific challenge faced by a specific subset of people because of the volatility of oil and the high price, and this is not an undermining of the carbon tax policy. It's not unfair. What's your reaction to that?
Well, he's wrong. It absolutely undermines the policy. The reason the federal government said that they needed to have a federal tax is so that every region of the province, every ratepayer, ended up paying the same thing. They argued that before the Supreme Court. And so here we are a couple of years later, and they're already making exceptions and essentially basically saying if you want an exception, you have to vote for the Liberals. And if you if you don't have vote for the Liberals, you're not going to get an exception. If the fuel tax is causing affordability problems in the winter because of home heating, it's causing a problem everywhere. It's not just in Atlantic Canada. It's in the West where we use natural gas. It's places where they use propane. And he would be very wise to rethink the tax in the first place, take it off of home heating, and rethink his policy. We've been calling for an end to the carbon tax. And these are the reasons why, because it's painful. The amount of the rate is too high. It's creating a massive affordability crisis, and we're all feeling it.
I heated my home with oil when I lived in St. John's. I heat my home with gas now that I live in Ottawa, and the price gap is enormous. Oil, much, much higher. So part of the argument is that there's just no comparison in the prices, and when the volatility hits oil, it spikes crazy high. I mean, do you understand at least some of that economic argument being made for these changes?
Well, we've been making the economic argument. Every single person in this country is feeling the pinch because of the inflation crisis. A lot of that is being driven because the carbon tax is driving up the cost of everything. We're getting into winter in places that rely on hydrocarbon fuels for their power grid, for their home heating. It's really painful. And I don't think that he's appreciating just how much division he's creating by saying one group of citizens is entitled to a tax break and another group is not. That's just not fair.
So Stephen Guilbeault, the Environment Minister, he gave an interview to my colleague Danielle with Radio Canada this weekend, and he said this is it. There's no more exemptions. That this would be the only thing. As long as he's Environment Minister, that will be exempt. I know you've tangled with Minister Guilbeault over the clean energy grid regulations in 2035. How does it make you feel about the possibility of you getting what you're looking for when the minister has redrawn, I guess, the line in the sand on this?
Well, I have to tell you, I think their policy is an utter chaos. And what they need to do is be working with the provinces. The recent Supreme Court decision that acknowledged that provinces have the right to develop their resources, have the right to develop their own electricity grid, and that the federal government can't be using a pretext to make unilateral policy. They have to work in a spirit of cooperative federalism. I haven't seen much of that from Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault. I'm hoping that he changes his tune. But this kind of approach that they take, where they give a special exception and then basically say we did it because they voted for the Liberals and too bad to everybody else. That's not good for the country. It's divisive, and they need to go back to the drawing board on this. I would like to see them eliminate the carbon tax altogether, particularly on home heating, because it's painful in Alberta coming up on the winter months as well. You've also seen what Scott Moe is now going to do. Scott Moe said, hey, look, we're not going to collect it anymore. They have a Crown Corporation in Saskatchewan. So now you've got a problem where you've broken down the principle of the policy all across the country. So they've made a mess of it, and now it's up to them to fix it.
Well, that was a perfect segue, because we're going to speak to Premier Moe later in the show, and I was going to ask you about that. He says come January 1, Sask Energy is just not going to collect the carbon tax when it comes to home heating with natural gas. Is that something Alberta would consider, or is Saskatchewan alone on this one?
Well, we don't have the ability to do that. Saskatchewan has, of course, a Crown Corporation.
Right.
So Sask Energy has the ability to do that. We have a private market, and so we have a number of different players in our private market. I can't ask them to break the law. But here we are in a situation where we're going to have different policy in every part of the province because the federal government is not enacting a policy fairly in each of the different regions. So they've made a mess of it, and I think that they should acknowledge that rather than trying to deflect, and then do what is right, do what is fair, and take the fuel tax off all home heating fuel.
You say you can't ask private companies to break the law. Is that what you think Scott Moe would be doing? He's acknowledged that in the Twitter video he put out, sort of saying some people will say this is against the law, but he kind of says based on what happened in Atlantic Canada, he's prepared to do it. Is this what Saskatchewan is threatening to do illegal in your view?
Well, the federal, he says it is. The federal government does have the ability under the Constitution. The Supreme Court rendered a judgment saying that they could apply the federal carbon tax. But I think that they said that because they expected the federal government would apply it equally to the regions, fairly across all fuel types and to every citizen. When they're not doing that, they've undermined the case that they have made for why they should have this power in the first place. And so I can see why Premier Moe is taking the decision that he did. We don't have the ability to do that. We don't have a Crown Corporation here, and we have many private sector companies. I certainly wouldn't ask them to do that. But why should we have this level of unfairness where our neighbor in Saskatchewan isn't going to have the tax, our neighbors in Atlantic Canada won't, and we do? That doesn't seem to be a very constructive way of proceeding on this policy. It's way too divisive.
You've referenced it a couple of times in this conversation about what Goody Hutchings, the Rural Development Minister, said to my colleague Vashi Kapelos at CTV over the weekend that the prairies should elect more Liberals if they want to have those conversations. I asked Seamus O'Regan about that. He kind of said, I don't know what she meant by that. He wouldn't really engage on it in a meaningful way. What do you think she meant, and what are the implications of what she said?
Well, I have to tell you, it sounds like the kind of thing that they joke around the cabinet table all the time. Well, you know, if they want anything from us, I guess they should just vote for more Liberals. That's not appropriate, and it's not the way a government should act. When you get elected as a government, you're a government for all people, all regions, regardless of whether they voted for you or not. And when you enact a policy and you go to the court saying that you have to enact it because you are the only one who can enact it fairly, and then you enact it unfairly, then you undermine your credibility. So I have to say that I think it expressed what we have often felt in Western Canada, that they have no interest in coming to the table in a spirit of true cooperative federalism, and that's got to end. We all share the same objectives. We all want to make sure that we're reducing emissions, but we have to make sure we take care of our people first. And our people are suffering an affordability crisis, a lot of it being caused by the punitive carbon taxes levied by the federal government, and now they can't even enact them fairly. And so they'll make a reprieve in a region of the country that tends to vote for more Liberal MPs. That's just not right.
So, Premier, what do you do about it at this point? Like, I know you're upset, and you're talking to me, and you're making the case to a national audience. Scott Moe is going to do something you do not have the capacity to do because of the different structures of your energy markets. Is there a legal recourse or any other sort of option you can take, or is this strictly a political fight at this point?
Well, I hope there's a political solution to this. I mean, even our own NDP opposition in Alberta has said that has taken the same position as we have, which is that we need to have fairness across the country. And so this is no longer a partisan issue in our province. We think it's outrageous that the federal government would disadvantage our region compared to another region in the country. So I would say that you'll see a unified voice coming out of Alberta saying that we want some fairness. I'd like to see the two Liberal MPs that Albertans did elect, Randy Boissonnault and George Chahal, stand up and advocate on our behalf if that's what it takes, according to the minister. But this is not the way to create unity. This is not the way to get people on board with the overall agenda of reducing emissions. If one part of the province can get a reprieve and the other can, that's just not fair.
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, thanks for taking the time today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
The Prime Minister admitted that he's not worth the cost by announcing that he would pause his carbon tax for some people on some fuels for some period of time.
Certainly it is very important that we are addressing both affordability concerns and fighting climate change across this country.
One topic dominated today's debate in the House of Commons, the decision by the federal government to exempt home heating oil from the carbon tax for 3 years. It's a move that largely benefits Atlantic provinces, with some Western premiers calling it unfair. Scott Moe is one of those premiers. He's the Premier of Saskatchewan, and he joins me now. Premier Moe, thanks for taking the time.
No, thank you, David.
The federal government justifies exemption for home heating oil by saying oil is much less efficient than natural gas, has seen larger increases in costs, and it simply makes the situation unaffordable for a small subset of people in Atlantic Canada. Did you buy that argument?
Oh, no, not at all. Listen, we heat our homes in different ways across this country. We have 85% of Saskatchewan residents use natural gas, but there is a certain number that use propane or even electric heat in some of our northern and many Indigenous communities throughout the north. Also expensive, also unfairly, I think, having this carbon taxation scheme, of which we've never agreed with, being applied to them. And so at the end of the day, this scheme, we've always thought it's the wrong policy, but it has, outside of Quebec, been applied fairly uniformly across the nation. That no longer is true. And what we've said is the federal government should, if they do make an exemption in what is predominantly an Atlantic Canadian exemption, they should extend that to all Canadians across the nation. If they don't, Saskatchewan will take matters into our own hands. Okay,
I want to talk about that. Just for the audience at home, Quebec is exempt from this because they have a cap and trade system that the federal government says meets its standards, so therefore the carbon price isn't applied there the way it is in other provinces. But on your the last thing you said there about take matters into your own hands, I saw in your Twitter feed today, you said come January 1, you're going to tell Sask Energy to stop collecting the carbon tax on natural gas for home heating and stop remitting that money to the federal government. And you admitted that it is probably illegal. I mean, are you prepared to break the law to protest this?
Well, first, we would hope that it never comes to that. We would hope that the federal government would make a decision to ensure that all Canadian families are being treated equally. And this whole conversation is about fairness for Canadian families, and in our case, the families that we represent in Saskatchewan. With respect to the entire carbon taxation scheme, we've always felt it's the wrong policy. But really what we're doing in this case is doing what the federal government is doing. And so if it's deemed illegal for a provincial government to provide that benefit or that pause for 3 years on carbon tax for how they heat their home, the federal government is doing that in one area of Canada. And so we're really mirroring or emulating what the federal government is doing. And so if that would be deemed to be illegal at the provincial level, I think the federal government would have some challenges defending their decision as well.
Well, and I'm not defending what the government has done here, but it's a federal tax, right? So they can decide what happens with it, I guess, right? Like you have no authority. We've spoken in the past about respecting jurisdictions. This is their jurisdiction, whether you like what they're doing with it or not. And some of the analysis I've read of what you're proposing to do here, Premier Moe, is that you're just going to be on the hook for the money that you're not collecting and have to remit it to the federal government anyway.
This is federal jurisdiction. As described by the Supreme Court of Canada, the reason this is federal jurisdiction is so that the federal government can uniformly apply their carbon tax scheme to all Canadians across Canada. If you go back to the Supreme Court ruling, that was very clear in that particular ruling. And so we've always said it's the wrong policy, but as I said, outside of Quebec, it's been fairly uniformly applied. That's no longer true today. And so what we've asked the federal government is to revisit the regionality of the policy that they've come forward with, revisit it with an eye to treating all Canadian families the same. We all have affordability challenges. In Saskatchewan, our natural gas bills, 40% of those are compromised from carbon taxation. And so we all do have affordability challenges regardless of where we live. We would ask the federal government to make a decision that with more of an eye to treating Canadian families equitably. We think that's the right thing to do for any government, regardless of their stripes. And it's what we would ask the federal government to do. If they don't, then we are willing to take some steps here in Saskatchewan that would mirror or emulate what they are doing already in Atlantic Canada.
But Premier, I wonder what sort of legal analysis you've had done on that, in terms of your ability to do this, the financial implications of if you do it, because if you don't take in the revenue on the bills, Sask Energy or the government could end up being on the hook for this, and it just becomes a cash transfer from the government or the Crown Agency of Saskatchewan to the federal government rather than collecting it from your ratepayers.
Or the entire policy could fall by the wayside due to the fact that the federal government is not implementing it equitably across the nation of Canada, which was the very reason that this was deemed to be in the federal jurisdiction. What was shared jurisdiction, the federal government was able to do this with the understanding that they would do it fair and equitably from coast to coast in the nation. They're not doing that anymore.
Right, but the Supreme Court decision, and look, I'm not a lawyer, so forgive me, it was a recognition that because of the polluting effects of greenhouse gases, it goes across different jurisdictions. It's not contained within a particular provincial boundary. Therefore, it falls into the federal government's constitutional authority to price. I mean, they still have the legal right to do this, because it's not, and this is why they had the ability, for example, not to impose it in Quebec or in other provinces when they had programs that met their stringency requirement. So they do have latitude and discretion in how it's applied. I just wonder if you're potentially setting yourself up for a big legal fight if you go down this path.
No, before we ever come to any decisions on January 1st, one would truly hope that we don't live in a nation that is anywhere near that divisive. A nation where a federal government would choose one area for political reasons, it appears, to choose one area of Canada to not have to pay their carbon taxation scheme while the rest of the nation ultimately would have to. And so we feel that there's a real opportunity here for the federal government to revisit the decision that they've made, revisit it in the best interest of all Canadian families. At the end of the day, this conversation is not about, for example, Saskatchewan picking a fight with the federal government. This is about fairness for the families that we collectively represent. 13 premiers will be together next week. I'm sure this is going to be part of that discussion. I'm sure other premiers are hearing about the inherent unfairness of the policy that has been introduced by the federal government. And we would ask them to revisit it. That is the right thing to do. And I would say that's the Canadian thing to do.
That's right. Yeah, the Council of the Federation is meeting in Halifax, I believe, next week. But, Premier, I wonder on this point, Goody Hutchings, the Minister of Rural Economic Development, made some comments over the weekend in an interview with CTV saying that a line along the lines that the Atlantic Caucus was able to make its case and maybe the Prairies needs to elect more Liberals. So you can hear that the argument can be made by Western MPs as well. I don't know if there's been some walking back of that or not, but how do you interpret those comments and what effect is it having in your province?
Well, I would say entirely disappointing to have a member of government or in cabinet, no less, that feels that they're part of a government that doesn't represent all Canadians. That would be disappointing, I think, not only for myself as a resident of Saskatchewan, as a premier of a province in this nation that I still think is great, but I think would be disappointing for the vast majority of Canadians as well. Listen. Provincial residents have other ways to have their voice heard. Saskatchewan's voice very much is being heard today through their provincial government, and I'm certain that will continue in the days ahead. And what we have said, and we've been very clear, is first and foremost, we've always said this carbon taxation scheme just simply is not the right policy. In fact, we think it should be scrapped for everyone on everything. And that would be our primary policy position in this province. Second, we would say that the federal government, when they make changes like they have, specific to home heating oil that specifically do target Atlantic Canada, that they would revisit that in an effort to treat all Canadians equitably. And if they don't, we've been very clear with respect to what we ultimately will look at doing here in the province of Saskatchewan to ensure fairness for Saskatchewan families.
So Premier, there's no indication, just as a final question, they're going to scrap the whole thing. Certainly, they're pretty wedded to this, the federal Liberals are. And Minister Guilbeault spoke with my colleague Danielle at Radio Canada this weekend and said, no more carve-outs. This is it, as far as he's concerned, as Environment Minister. So just as a final point, what's your reaction to the Minister seemingly closing the door to what you're asking for?
Well, I would say a month ago, Minister Guilbeault said there was no carve-outs at all. In the last week, we've seen a significant carve-out for one area of the nation, and I have no idea how this federal government is not going to reduce or mirror that for all Canadians across the nation. And so Guilbeault's words really, aren't worth that much in today's day and age. And we'll see where this goes. We know where it's going in Saskatchewan. We would hope that the federal government, and have given the federal government a great opportunity, I think, to make a decision to treat all Canadians equally, regardless of where you live. And if they don't, we're going to take action to ensure that Saskatchewan families do experience the same degree of fairness that we're seeing for Atlantic Canadian families. But I'm sure this is going to be much discussed in the days ahead. But not a lot of faith in what Minister Guilbeault has been saying the last while, or with respect to what's occurred and what the federal government has decided. It doesn't look like his colleagues have much either.
Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, thanks for your time today.
Take care, David.
Well, there are others who disagree with this carbon tax exemption for home heating oil, but for very different reasons than Premier Moe. To give us an assessment of the federal government's change to the carbon tax, we turn now to Trevor Tombe, a professor of economics at the University of Calgary. Professor Tombe, it's good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
You said on your Twitter feed, the carbon tax is effectively dead and the federal government killed it in the dumbest way possible. What do you mean?
One of the key arguments for carbon taxes is uniformity of treatment across regions, across individuals, across businesses of different sectors, to really just provide an incentive for those who have easy, low-cost ways to avoid emitting to do so. And once you start carving out one exception, you ramp up pressure to carve out for other exceptions. We're seeing that right now with many Premier Scott Moe, Danielle Smith, even Ontario Premier Ford calling for natural gas to be accepted. And they do it on home heating in a way that undermines their primary political argument for the carbon tax, which up until last week, it was that it was a measure that put more money in the pockets of Canadians and therefore helped with affordability. And now they're saying the exact reverse message, that exempting its coverage helps with affordability. And that will make it really difficult to call or to resist calls to remove the carbon price from other fuels, even transportation fuels.
So one of the issues with home heating oil, and I used home heating oil when I lived in St. John's, and it was the wild swings in the price, right? In that, as oil prices went up over $100, I remember it was almost $800 for a single month in a St. John's winter, because oil was up to like $160 a barrel or something in that neighborhood. And that puts people in a situation where no matter what market signal you send, they just don't have the means to make the transition that they're hoping to encourage. Is that a valid argument, that the affordability goes beyond simply the carbon price? Because that's what the government is saying.
Well, wild swings in energy prices are not unique to home heating. Natural gas has also seen very considerable price swings over time, as has transportation fuel, all things that are exposed to world oil prices. And if volatility is the issue, there are ways of thinking about how to address that from a policy perspective. You could spread costs out over many more months. You could think about having regulatory approaches that some jurisdictions do with gasoline, for example, having regulated prices as a way to try and smooth the volatility that we see there. If one has concerns around whether or not home heating oil has risen to a level that has made it really difficult for individuals to afford, the alternative policy prescription would be to provide cash transfers, to provide lump sum rebates, which is the way that we've addressed affordability concerns around carbon pricing up to this point. And so to now start exempting fuels to address affordability, that makes it really difficult to resist similar arguments right across the board, which is why I'm concerned that this move absolutely did completely change the game on carbon pricing in a way that may lead to its eventual removal, at least at the retail level, putting industrial emitters aside.
When this regime first came in nationally, a lot of the Atlantic provinces, if not all of them, weren't on the federal backstop. They had their own policy solutions that at least got them to the stringency requirements in the opening days. But they exempted things like this, and then as the price rose, they couldn't hit the target, so they had to just bail out and sign on to the federal backstop. What does this exemption do to the argument that you need to hit a certain standard in order to be considered legitimate? Is the federal government hitting their own standard now in Atlantic Canada?
So that's right. Carving out this exemption does mean that the federal backstop no longer likely complies with the federal government's own benchmark. Let's not forget that the reason why the federal backstop applies in the Atlantic region today is because the provincial pricing systems that the governments at the provincial level were proposing did want to exempt home heating oil. And that was something that the government rejected because it was not broad enough coverage. Now, I can appreciate that moving from $0 a ton to $65 a ton on home heating on July 1, that's a big change, a much bigger change than what other heating fuels have seen because we gradually increased the price. But now I think about 3 years from now when they are going to return the carbon tax to heating oil, then the carbon price, if it still exists, will be $110 a barrel. And so the shock will be even larger. So this is a pause that gets harder and harder to put back with each year that passes.
So the solution, the government argues, is aggressive incentives to get people to transition to heat pumps. Just as a final point, if the market signal from the price was too much for people to bear, that's the argument from the government, will these incentives to transition to heat pumps, do you think those will be attractive enough to get it at the scale they need to avoid a real problem 3 years from now?
Well, we have been seeing actually some pretty significant moves away from heating oil in many provinces. So the latest data we have is 2021, and Prince Edward Island has about 40% of homes with oil as their primary heating system. But as recently as 2017, just 4 years prior, it was 65% of PEI residents using heating oil. So there can be, in relatively short order, some big moves in the amount of homes that are actually using this fuel. But 3 years from now, there is still going to be a substantial number of homeowners in the Atlantic region using this fuel. And it'll be really hard at that point to return carbon pricing at $110 a barrel, because if it was hard enough to go to 65, it's going to be that much more so to go to 110.